Well, we're glad you are here for the final week of this series, Mind Games. And today specifically, as you just saw in that video, we're going to talk about money. But since money is such a really touchy subject in our culture, I want to talk to you about something you know very well that's a little to the side of that, but it's really on point. I want you to think about greed. Because here's the mind game associated with greed in our culture, or at least this is the way I see it. Greed is one of those things that if I asked you, hey, do you know what greed looks like, and do you know somebody that represents that? All of you would be able to think of a person. Now, it might be fictional, like, Ebenezer Scrooge or somebody like that for you, but everybody's got a person who's greedy. They know what it looks like. But I've never heard anybody apply that word to themselves. Like, I've been doing this thing, helping people with spiritual life for a long time. And I've had people confess everything to me. Now, I've never had anybody confess murder to me, and I'm not looking for any of you to do that to me today. But I've had people confess all kinds of other stuff. Like, I've had people confess unbelievable sexual kind of things to me, way more sexual stuff than I really wanted to know about. I've had people talk about they were the fault in their marriage because they committed adultery, or they were physically abusive, emotionally abusive. I had people talk about abusing children. I've had people confess to me unbelievable stuff. But I have never had anybody after a message or come set up an appointment to talk to me or email me and said, hey, Ed, I really need help, and I want you to try to help me. I figured out what my problem is. I'm just so greedy. That's my problem. And it's just interesting. We all know what it looks like. We think we can see it in other people, but it doesn't really apply to us. And the reason is, I think, because of the way our culture works and the mind game, Jesus says there's a deceiver that's deceiving us. The deception around money and stuff and greed in our culture is this. I look at me and my heart, and I begin to see other people in need, and I feel compassion for them, like I have a friend that's in need, and I want to help them. And I say to myself, well, I can't possibly be greedy, because when I see people in need, I'm moved by that, and I have generous feelings toward them when I see their need. But I look at other people, and I say, that dude's greedy because he keeps everything for himself. Well, what's he feel in his heart? Well, I don't know what he feels in his heart, but I see what he does. Well, but you did the same thing. You just talked about what you feel. Well, don't judge me by what I do. I know my heart. Judge me by my feelings. But let's look at him, and he's greedy because I see what he does. But don't look at what I do. Judge me by my heart. That's sort of the way we look at it in our culture. I'm not greedy because I have compassionate feelings, even though I don't really give very much to help with the things that move me. But Jesus comes along, and Jesus turns this whole thing of greed and stuff and ownership, this whole deal of greed, Jesus turns it on its head and puts a whole new spin on it. In fact, I just want to say, before I get too far into this, that what we're going to talk about today is so hard and so uncomfortable, and the reason it's so uncomfortable is because you're going to understand it. It's not going to be hard to understand, but it's uncomfortable because it doesn't seem to make common sense in our culture. And the reason for that is because of the mind game, the deception that's being going on. Because there's just a way to think about stuff. There's just a way we think about money. There's a way that we think about my stuff and my things. And it's so commonplace. It's just like the air that we breathe. It's the way most of us think. And then Jesus shows up and he says, hey, that's not just the way it is, or at least it's not the way that it has to be. There is another way to do money and stuff. There's a way that God wants it to be. And greed, you're greedy because of the way you do things. And I want to show you a different way to see money and stuff, and it'll free you up. Now, here's what Jesus says about greed. Now, I know nobody listening to me is greedy. None of us are greedy, but maybe you know somebody it is, and this will help. So don't check out. Here's what Jesus says greed is. Greed is a prison that locks me in with my stuff. Greed is a prison that locks me in with my money and my stuff, and it locks God and other people out. Greed's a prison that ultimately it locks me in and it locks me away from God and other people. And here's what happens. In our freedom, like we talked about early on in this series, in our freedom to do what we want to do with our money and our stuff, and our freedom that we handle our money and our stuff the way we want to, over time, we actually lose our freedom to greed And we get locked in a prison with our money and our stuff, and it locks God and other people out. Now, to make that clear, Jesus tells a story. And so I want to share with you today the story that Jesus winds up telling. Before he tells us the story, he gives us a principle that goes with the story, and then at the very end, he comes back and applies it, just to make clear to us what he's trying to say about this. So he exposes our wrong way of thinking. Let me read it to you. Here is Luke chapter 12, verse 13. He gives the principle first. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus, I'm here because you have authority. I like the way you teach. And so I'm asking you, tell my brother, and I like to imagine the brother's probably standing right there with him and they've been arguing. Tell my brother to divide this inheritance we got with me. Jesus replied to the guy, "Man, who appointed me as judge or arbiter between you?" Like, how do I get to be in charge of your family mess? And then he said to them, I think to all the crowd, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed." Now, when I read that, my first thought is, I didn't even know there were different kinds of greed. I thought greed, I could look at it and I could spot it in other people. But Jesus says, that's because you don't understand greed. Yeah, there are different ways greed sort of gets into you. You don't really get that. It's subtle. Some of them are very subtle kind of ways. You think greed's something you can spot in other people, but it doesn't apply to you because you have good feelings. But greed, it's so dangerous that Jesus gives a double warning. Watch out, be on your guard against every form of greed. This is a huge kind of thing that Jesus wants to talk about. And then he gives us a principle. He says, life, and this is one of those things that Jesus says that it's just so obvious that we miss it, and it doesn't initially even make sense to us because we don't think this way because of the mind game. He says, life does not consist in an abundance of possession. Jesus says, a man's life, a woman's life, a person's life does not consist, it is not made up of the abundance of their possessions. Now here's all he means by that. And we know this is what he means because of the story that he's going to tell in just a minute. It illustrates this principle. And in one way, again, this is just so obvious that when I say it to you, you're going to wonder, now why did Jesus need to say that? I mean, you're going to hear me say it and you're going to go, well, duh, yeah, that's so obvious. Here's what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying there is no correlation between the amount of stuff you have and the amount of time or life that you have. There's no correlation between the number of things that you accumulate and the number of time or the number of minutes that you have left in your life. To which all of us go, well, yeah, I mean, nobody even thinks that's true. I mean, nobody's thinking that, Jesus, that stuff equals life. But I want to just ask you to step back for a second and think about the way, the attitude that our whole culture, that all of us tend to have about things, toward money, toward stuff, whether saving or buying or I need it or I've got to have it or I want it. I mean, if somebody were to come to our culture and watch the way we treated money and stuff and they watched how we pursued it, they might draw the conclusion that that stuff we have must be what gives us life. Because we treat money and stuff like the rest of the world treats food. Got to have it. Like they treat water. If you don't have it, you'll die. I mean, got to have it, got to get an upgrade, got to get the better one, got to rent this one, got to get rid of the old one, got to have this new thing, got to have it. That's the way we live. That's the mind game we get caught up in, even though we know this. I mean, we often wind up living our life like money and stuff equals life. As if specifically, there is a direct correlation between the stuff I have and the amount of time I get on this planet. Now, I just say to you again, I know nobody listening, nobody thinks that way. Nobody really believes that. Nobody has ever said, hey, honey, we really need to start saving more money because if we don't, we're going to die. I mean, nobody even thinks that way. But Jesus, who knows our heart and looks at our culture, and he looks at the culture that he's living in, and he says, he considers everything that's going on, and he says, hey, I'm just telling you, you need to wake up and you need to consider that it's true that you live your life and you pursue money and stuff as if life equals stuff, as the amount of stuff you have equals the amount of life that you will get. Even though no one has ever been called about somebody they love who died, and you go, oh, no, they died, what happened? And they say, well, you know, John went and applied for that car loan, and he didn't get that car loan, and he just died. If he'd have got that loan, he might have got another few more months, but couldn't get the loan. He just died. I mean, nobody equates that. Nobody thinks money, stuff equals the amount of time that you have. But Jesus says, hey, I'm just telling you, even though you wouldn't say you believe that, most of us wind up living our life as if what we have equates to the amount of time that we have. Jesus says, look, I know your heart, and your heart is evidenced by the way that you actually live. You live your life. I mean, think about it. You go into debt for stuff you'll throw away. You go into slavery to banks and to credit cards for stuff that doesn't even matter. You hurt people. You ruin relationships. You worry. You spend all of your life and ruin the relationships that are around you for the sake of stuff. And Jesus says, you look at that, and if I were to say to you, hey, what really matters most to you? You'd go, well, my health and my life. And he says, and yet you pursue stuff as if that's what's most important to you. You pursue stuff like it has some direct correlation to your life and your health. Even though you know no one has ever died for lack of stuff. Lack of medical care, yes. Lack of water, yes. Lack of food, yes. But nobody has ever run out of stuff, and the moment they got their last thing taken away from them, they just fell over dead. That's not the way you even think. But Jesus says, that's the way we've been deceived into living our life. And to illustrate that, he tells us a parable. He says to them, here it is, the ground, and that's really key to this parable, the ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. Now, let's just say this out loud. Where did the crop come from? Let me say it out loud. The ground. So who specifically did the crop come from? That's right. It came from God. Now just let that sink in. And then I want you to notice the personal pronouns that this guy uses. He thought, the ground of a certain man, a rich man, produced a crop, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns, and I'll build bigger ones, and then I will store up my surplus grain, and I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. And here's a guy that, right up front, he forgets where it all comes from. The ground produced the crop. Thank you very much, ground. Thank you very much, God. Secondly, he forgot that what he had, what he thought, like we all tend to think, he thought that the reason I have so much, is the reason it came to me, is it must be for me. The reason I have it is it must all be for me. So I'm going to take what I have and I'm going to store it up, because if I have plenty of stuff in barns, then I can have a good life. I can say, take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. Jesus says, this guy he made some really critical mistakes in his thinking. Jesus said, and here's the first two words, and they're huge. But God. Oh yeah, him. Jesus is just so smart. I mean, he's just this masterful storyteller. He's so brilliant in the way he goes about it. He says, if all there was to this life, I mean, just think about it. If all there was to this life was this life, if like everything that happened in this life is the only thing that matters, there's nothing after this life, then the way this guy lived his life and he stored it all up in barns, he was brilliant. I mean, if there are no if there are bookends to life and it's my death at one bookend, there's my birth and there's my death and all my life is what's in between. If there's nothing after that death, then this guy is doing it exactly right. But Jesus says he forgot. But God. But God. See, here's the lie. Here's the mind game. Mind game is that we can focus so much on this life that ultimately we focus so much on our stuff and our money, and we become greedy people without even knowing it. It's so subtle, and it locks us in a prison of thinking it's about me and mine and my barns and my stuff, and we get locked in that prison, and it locks God out of our thinking and everybody else. That's the nature of greed. We forget the source, and we forget why we have what we have. And ultimately, we forget that we have a limited amount of time. See, this guy made several faulty assumptions. He assumed that if it came to him, it was all his. He assumed that God had no interest in his life, even though the ground is what produced it for him. And he assumed that he had time that he did not, in fact, have. I mean, look at what happened. But God said to him, "You fool." And he wasn't a fool, Jesus. This guy was a brilliant financier. I mean, this guy was a great farmer. He's a great businessman. Jesus said, "No, this guy's a fool because he left me out of the equation of his life. You fool. This very night, your life." Now, think about it. That thing that you said, life, I can take life easy. I'll just take it easy. This night, your soul, your life is demanded of you. And then look at this question. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? And Jesus' obvious answer he is wanting us to think is someone else, not you. That's who will get it. You see, this is so logical, and it's just so common sense, and you see it. And I mean, here's the great thing about the Bible. You come in sometimes and we read the Bible and we talk about it, and it's like a curtain gets pulled back and you see what God sees for a minute, and you see the world the way God sees it, and it's so crystal clear to you. And then you walk out of here and you drive back into our culture, and what was so crystal clear to you becomes foggy again in the mind game of our culture. And so we live and we function and we buy and we borrow, and we hold on to, and we ignore, and we don't give because it's all like our stuff equals the amount of life that we have. Like we have to get more stuff and hold on to more stuff, and if we can have more stuff, we can have more life. Now, no one would say that they actually believe that. But that's the way we live. And we make the same mistakes that this guy winds up making. We forget where it all came from. We forget to factor God into the equation as if he had no interest in this stuff. We think that if it came to us, it was all for us. And we assume that we have time that we do not, in fact, know that we have. And so Jesus applies it. This, then, is how it will be for anyone who stores up things for himself but is not rich toward God. That is, the person who is not rich toward God, and I'm going to explain what he means by that in just a minute. The person who saves up things for themselves and fully funds their 401k and fully pays off their retirement and fully gets to the place where it's me and mine and my. Here's what I will do for me and mine and mine. And then you die, and everything you spent and everything you invested and everything that you had your life that was going to give you more life, but God steps in and everything you have is taken away from you, and you have nothing to show for it. Nothing in this life that a prison of stuff locked you into, and nothing in the life that is to come. You have total, complete loss. Greed has completely deceived you, and it's completely locked you in. And in the end, you do what you already knew everybody does. You leave everything. In the end, everybody gives everything they have. Jesus says, but you had the opportunity to be rich toward God. And if you will be rich toward God, if you will just pull back the curtain and see it the way that God sees it, and you will be rich toward God, then the day will come where you will have joy in this life because you gave. And when but God comes and your time is done, you'll be rich toward God in the next life as well. But if you hoard and you spend on yourself and in yours, and then but God happens, it will be total, complete, horrible loss. If we forget to factor God into the equation, if we forget where it came from, if we forget why we have it, if we assume time, then by definition, when we live that way, we are greedy. So, what does it mean to be rich toward God? I mean, that's a phrase we don't use every day. What does that actually mean? Well, Jesus goes on to talk to this same crowd for a little bit in this chapter, and I don't really have time to go through all of those verses with you. You can read them later. But near the middle of that discussion with them, Jesus gives a definition of how you become rich toward God. And so I just want to drop down to that part, show you what he says you have to do to be rich toward God. So here's what he says, verse 33 and 34. Sell your possessions, and then look at this, and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourself that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will not be exhausted, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. You see, being rich toward God is just you giving toward what God really cares about. Jesus defines it for us. Being rich toward God isn't about your prayer life. It isn't about how much you serve. It isn't about how loud you sing. It isn't about how often you come. All those things matter. But the way that you are rich toward God is you give toward what God actually cares about. You invest in what God cares about. God, what is it in our world that you genuinely care about? How can I invest in that? God, what are you really up to? How can I be a part of what you are actually doing? And Jesus says, hey, in his day, he said, hey, why don't you care about the poor? God really cares about the poor. In his day, it was widows and orphans. I mean, there were no government programs. There were no churches. There were no Salvation Army. There was no United Way. There was nobody taking care of that thing. I mean, there was the temple, but even the temple, they got taxed to take care of. So Jesus says, hey, after you pay your taxes to the Roman government, after you pay your temple tax, that all of that's taken care of, and you think that all the rest of what you have after all of that is for you, he says, look, you need to sell some of that, and you need to give it to the people that God really cares about. And by investing in what God cares about, you become rich toward God. And in the end, you will not suffer total loss. He says, we wind up living in a culture that sells us this mind game of you think because you have a lot of stuff that you can store up your stuff and you can have more life with the stuff you have. But if you buy into that game, you have all this stuff and you have it all in this world, it will lock you in a prison where you eventually lock God and everybody else out. And you may have all the stuff in the world and everything you want is fully funded, but you cannot continue to live your life like life equals stuff. Stuff will make me have more life. He says, if you want to be rich toward me and not suffer total loss, remember where it came from. And remember that God is interested in you and your stuff. And remember, you do not know how much time you have, so use your limited amount of time to invest in what God cares about for the life that is to come. Now, here's where all of this unravels on us in our life. Because there's some of you sitting here and you're thinking to yourself, man, that's exactly right, Ed. I totally agree with you, and I love this church, and it's so clear to me when you teach. I completely understand it, and I have some friends that are in real need, and my heart goes out to them, and I want to give, but, and I'll just say it for you, you wouldn't put it in these words, but you'd say, but I can't give, and the reason you can't give is because I spend it all on me. I spend it all that I have on me and mine. And when I look at my house payment, because they put a gun to my head and made me buy that big house with that big payment. When I look at the amount of I having a car payment, because people made me drive that big car. They made me get that second loan. They made that happen. When I look at how much I have and the debts that I've taken on and the things that I bought, when I look at all that I have committed to, that for me and mine to just make it by in this world, I don't have anything left over to give, but my heart is good. And Jesus says, your heart's not good. You're greedy. Because where your treasure is, that's where your heart is, and your treasure is all on you. I'm not greedy. I have such warm feelings for other people. And God says, I don't care about your feelings. I don't care how you feel about this. It's about what are you doing with your hands? What are you doing with what you have? What are you doing to invest in what God really cares about? And if you have gotten to the point where you're strapped so much that you have no margin where you give, let's just all be honest about it. You wouldn't say this about yourself, but the reason is it's greed. It's greed that got you there. And you're missing the opportunity of your life. And the net result, if you don't get it fixed, is when your time runs out, total loss. Everything you spent on you and yours, it's going to go. And you'll have nothing for the life that's to come. And we don't think that way. And that's so hard, and many of you are fighting it right now. And then there's another group of you that are sitting here listening to it, and you're saying, hey, I'm not over there because, I got plans. And as soon as I get my finances in order, and as soon as I fund my 401k, and as soon as I pay off my student loans, and as soon as I get it saved for my kids to be in college, and as soon as I get through all of these dozen things that I have on my list and my plan to do, as soon as I get all of that in order, I'm going to give toward God. And God says, wow, you are so greedy. God, I'm not greedy. I'm responsible. I have a good plan and I have good intentions. I don't care about your intentions. I don't care about your plans. You are not rich toward me because you don't know that the day you deposit your last check and it all goes into your 401k and it's all fully funded, you don't know that on that day your time may come to an end. You are assuming time that you do not have. You're assuming time that you don't know about. You're living as if there's a correlation between I have a plan and I'm paying it off and I'm getting more stuff and there'll always be time and I'll eventually get it done and then I'll have time to do all the stuff that my heart really wants to do. You're a fool, God says. You're living as if you have time that you don't know that you have. And here's the result's going to be. Total, complete loss. Isn't that painful? It's not just you. This hits me too because this is the only culture I live in. I don't think that way. Because my whole life long, I've lived in this culture, and our enemy says to us every day, your stuff is your stuff, and the reason other people don't have stuff that they even need you to give is because they didn't take care of their stuff, and if you don't take care of your stuff, if you start giving it away, you'll be just like they are. You better take care of your stuff, and then you give whatever little bit you have left over. That's what a responsible person does. But you know the truth? When you and I live that way, we're just so incredibly hypocritical. That's not hypocritical. Let me just follow me on this. See, if you live your life with that plan, you get it all funded, and you're so responsible, and you haven't ever, you don't give because you just don't have it. You got to get all of this taken care of, and then you're going to do what your heart tells you ought to do. If in the middle of getting all that done and things are going well, in the middle of that, if you have a financial crisis, are you not going to ask God to help you with your financial crisis? Are you not going to say to God, hey, help me out in this financial crisis? Wouldn't it be more non-hypocritical for you to say, hey, God, I know that what I'm doing right now is really my plan, and my plan is that I take care of me first, and I get that. And I know what you said about selling and helping the poor, and I know all of that, but I'm on my plan. And so I'm on my plan, and I'm getting this done, and I'm getting this done, and this done, and then when I get this done, I'm going to do your plan. So God, even though I'm in trouble right now, I'm just going to keep working my plan. It's hypocritical for me to ask you for help since I did not do what you asked me to do. No. None of us would do that. If we were in financial trouble and our plan got off track, we'd all go, God, help. At its core, it's hypocritical. We live like we want to, and then we ask God to bail us out. See, here's here's what the problem is. Not from my perspective, because again, believe me, this hits me as much as it hits anybody. But from God's perspective, here's the problem. We're greedy. We have a problem with greed. That's why Jesus said, hey, watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Not just the greed that hoards, but the greed that your heart's good, but you don't actually ever do anything. God says, from my perspective, if you're not rich toward me, if you're only rich toward you, if your thoughts about you are about how do I take care of me and how do I be responsible for me, and you don't ever do anything to be rich toward me, by definition, people who are not rich toward me, they're greedy. Now, you know what the solution is? And the solution is not for you to pray. It's not for you to get your heart right, because you already told me your heart's right. I don't have any reason to think that. It's not for you to pray something. The solution is so simple. And honestly, this is pretty easy for me to say, because I've been doing this for so long, it's almost like it's all I know. But I know for some of you, this is going to be like death when I say it, and you're going to argue with it, and you're not going to want to hear it. But the solution to this is really pretty simple. Here's what it is. You prioritize giving to God's kingdom over giving to your own. Here's practically how you do it. I've talked to people for a long time about 3 P's of killing greed. It is that you have percentage giving, and you make it a priority giving, and then you make it to the point where, and I just lost the last word. The last word is that you then get to the place it's progressive kind of giving. So you have percentage giving, it's priority giving, and then it's progressive kind of giving. Here's what I mean by percentage giving. Percentage is, I just pick a percentage. And the reason I pick a percentage and not a dollar amount is because as my income grows, if I pick a dollar amount, I'll play with, and I won't see God's blessing in my life. I pick a percentage, and as the percentage, I keep the percentage no matter what my income is. It can be 1%. You're not giving now, and you want to start giving toward God's kingdom? Pick a percentage, whatever percentage you want, and then you make that percentage a priority. You say up front, I'm going to make this a priority over everything else I give. And honestly, in our world, that is so easy to do. The way I do that in my life is I have in my online banking, I tell them to write the check that I want to give to the things God cares about. They write that. I don't ever have to ask them. I don't have to fund it every month. I don't have to go in and okay it every month. I tell them to send it without me even knowing it's going out. It's as if I have already committed. I have a percentage, and I make it the priority. It goes out before anything else. And then the last part is, as God blesses my life, I just up the percentage. I have a progressive kind of plan that as God blesses and more of the focus goes off of me, I progressively up the percentage to where I give more and more so that I can avoid the trap of greed. You know what happens? Your lifestyle begins to adjust, and greed has less of a hold on your life. And you find joy in giving that you did not even know was possible. So let me talk to you about next steps for just a second. And so if you'd go ahead and you grab the connection card that's on your chair, and you put your name on it, and then you just flip it over to the back where it says next steps. And if you're with us for the first time, let me just assure you, we do this every week, and the reason is because we don't think you came by accident, and we think there's something maybe God wants you to hear and to be part of, and maybe a next step that you can take. And we're not going to do anything weird with this. We literally do pray for every one of these cards by name, and we'd love to pray for you, and maybe for a next step that you're trying to take. Now, while you're filling that out, let me just say something to you for a second. Now, let's be honest. Some of you are sitting here and you decided about halfway through this that you weren't doing this, and what you've been saying in your mind is, oh, I get it. He just wants people to give money to him and to this church. So let me be clear. If the reason you don't make progress on this is because you think I want you to give to this church, one, I never said that, and that's not even what I'm pointing at. And if you think that I want you to give it just to this church, I want to say to you, I do not want you to give it here. Instead, I dare you to give to God's purposes, but do it somewhere else. I mean, At both of our campuses, and when you get in your car and you drive out and you turn to the left, not far to the left down there, there's a church. And you can just drive into their parking lot, leave your car running, walk in the front door, hand the first person you see money and say, here, I want to give this away. Get back in your car and drive away. They will tell that story forever. Or if you don't turn to the left, at both our campuses, if you turn to the right when you drive out, there's a church to the other side. You could go down there and you could walk in there and hand it out. And this will be their God story forever. Or if you don't want to give to a church, you will not have any trouble because everybody knows how to use Google, and you can Google an organization that is doing what God would want in this world, helping people that really need it, and you make that a priority. But let's be clear. If you walk out of here and you say, I'm not doing that because all he wanted was my money, you know that you are lying. Because I didn't say that. And worse than that, you are lying to yourself, and you're allowing greed. You're deceived, and you're being greedy because you're not even doing what God simply asked you to do, to give. And if you're a believer, you have to do this because you know the other side of this, but God. You know that there's not a bookend of death on your life. You know there's an eternity. And you don't want to come to the but God moment of your life and have total loss, where you've only invested in you and yours. When God gave you the opportunity, Jesus simply says, hey, you have some time. Make the most of your time. Invest in what God cares about. And if you don't do it because you're afraid, Jesus says, hey, you make me a priority. I'll take care of you. I'll take care of you. And if you can't do it because you've gotten yourself so far in debt, you're over your head, then we're doing a Dave Ramsey course, and your next step could be to take that course and help you begin to get your head above water so you can do what you say your heart wants to do. You pick a percentage. You make it a priority, and then as God blesses, you increase the percentage in your life, and you will avoid the greed monster. I mean, it isn't rocket science. This isn't even that hard. Jesus just says, and if you don't get this, and if you don't do it, let's just be clear. You're greedy. And you're going to suffer total loss. Let's make it real practical. Give first to my kingdom. I'll take care of you. And I'll provide for you. And I'll make sure you don't ever have a need, or you just continue to be deceived in the mind game of your enemy. So here's a question. Are you greedy? Are you greedy? No. I have generous feelings. That's not what we're asking, and now you know it. Are you building bigger barns because you assume that you have time that you don't know that you have? Jesus says you make sure you take advantage of the little bit of time you have and you invest in what God really cares about so that you can be rich toward God. Have you slipped into a form of greed that was so subtle you didn't even know that you were in it? I just want to say to you, if you have, as your pastor and as your friend, come on. Don't live that way. Pull back the curtain and see this for what it really is and live your life rich toward God. Let me pray for you. Father, I thank you for everybody that's joined in. And I pray that we will hear the clarity of God, of your words coming through what Jesus has taught us. Father, help us to not be deceived. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.